Welcome back to Christian Tradition. Today we are going to talk about the resurrection. In the history of human forensics, there is no event that has been more scrutinised, more debated, or more consequential than what allegedly happened in a suburban garden outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. If this event did not occur, if the heartbeat of that man did not restart, then Christianity is the most successful, tragic mistake in history. It is a 2 millennium long delusion that has fundamentally misdirected billions of lives. But if it did happen, if a man truly died and then walked out of a stone tomb after 3 days, then every scientific law, every political structure, and every human hope must be radically re-evaluated. Today we are moving past these Sunday school narratives. We aren't here for blind faith or sentimental tradition. We are approaching this as a cold case. We are going to apply the same historical and logical rigour that a lead investigator would apply to any other high-profile event in antiquity. To do this, we are grounding our investigation in the minimal facts framework. This is a methodology used by modern historical scholars, both theists and atheists, to filter the data. We aren't going to rely on Bible verses as if they are above question. Instead, we are looking only at the data points that are accepted as a historical bedrock by virtually every scholar in the field, from the most devout Christian to the most rigorous agnostic and atheist. Our goal is simple: to find the best explanation for those facts. We are looking for the theory that fits all the forensic data without relying on just so stories, multi-party conspiracies that ignore human psychology, or theories that fly in the face of the archaeological records. The original signal is there. We just need to be willing to follow the evidence, even if it leads us to a conclusion that is, by every standard of the first century, moronic and scandalous. In any old cold case, you start with the agreed facts, the data points that are so well supported that even the most hostile investigators have to admit they are true. In the case of the resurrection, we aren't just using faith as a starting point. We are using the minimal facts, a set of historical realities accepted by the vast majority of scholars today, including atheists and agnostics. Here are the 4 pillars of the case. Fact 1. Death by crucifixion. The execution of Jesus is a historical certainty. Roman soldiers were professional executioners. They didn't make mistakes. The secular receipt. Even Bart Ehrman, one of the world's leading agnostics, New Testament scholars, is blunt. The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans is one of the most secure facts we have from the whole of antiquity. The forensic weight. John Dominic Crossan, a highly sceptical scholar, adds that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. To deny the crucifixion is to deny the very foundations of ancient historiography. Fact 2. The disciples' sincere belief. Shortly after the execution, the disciples underwent a radical transformation. They didn't just feel better, they became absolutely convinced they had seen the risen Christ. They didn't gain wealth or power, they gained floggings, imprisonment and execution. The secular receipt. The late atheist historian Gerd Ludemann admitted it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. The forensic weight. As an investigator, you look for motive. People will die for a lie they believe is true, but they do not die for a lie they know they invented. The original signal was so strong that it turned cowards into martyrs. Fact 3. The conversion of enemies. The signal didn't just affect friends. It overrode the deepest biases of enemies. Saul of Tarsus, a brilliant Pharisee and a professional persecutor of the early church, had every social and political reason to see the movement fail. James, called the brother of Jesus, who was a documented skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, the secular receipt. Bart Ehrman notes, Paul was a persecutor of the early Christians. Then he had an experience that he was absolutely convinced was the appearance of Jesus. The forensic weight. You don't get this kind of total reversal from wishful thinking. It requires an external event so disruptive that it shatters a person's identity and career. Fact 4. The empty tomb. This is a physical receipt of the event. If the body was still in the tomb, the Sanhedrin could have ended the movement in 5 minutes by simply producing the corpse. The secular receipt. The atheist historian Michael Grant argued that if we apply the same criteria we use for other ancient sources, the evidence is sufficient to conclude that the tomb was indeed empty. The forensic weight. The criterion of embarrassment is key here. The first witnesses were women, at the time when female testimony was not legally valid in Judean courts. If the disciples were inventing a hoax, they would have found the tomb with a high-status male witnesses like Nicodemus. You only record women as the primary witnesses if they were actually there. We have the facts. The man dead, the followers transformed, the enemies defected, the tomb was empty. Now, as investigators, we have to ask, what is the best explanation for all four? Once the minimal facts are established, the skeptic must find a naturalistic explanation that fits the data. The two most common escape hatches are the hallucination theory and the stolen body theory. Under forensic scrutiny, both fall apart. Part 1. The hallucination theory, the psychological wall. Some argue the disciples didn't see a risen Jesus. They had bereavement hallucinations brought on by grief. But this theory hits a clinical wall. Hallucinations are like dreams. They are internal, subjective, and private. The forensic data. The group problem. Two people do not share the same dream. 500 people do not share the same interactive multisensory hallucination. The sensory problem. They weren't just visions. The signal involved sight, sound, and touch. The disciples reported eating with him, touching the wounds, and having long, complex conversations over 40 days. The expert receipt. Clinical psychologist Dr. Gary Collins is explicit on this point. Hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see them at a given time. They certainly are not something which can be seen by a group of people. As one scholar in the field noted, when you consider the sheer scale and variety of the appearances to individuals, to small groups, and to 500 people at once, the resurrection is actually a more probable explanation than a series of unprecedented, multi-sensory group hallucinations. Hallucinations don't empty tombs. They don't convince hard-headed skeptics, and they certainly don't create a worldwide movement. Part 2. The stolen body conspiracy. The logical wall. If they didn't hallucinate, did they steal the body? This theory comes in two main variants. Variant A, the apostles stole him. This theory suggests that the disciples stole the body and they knowingly died for a lie. The motive test. In any investigation, you look for the payoff. What did the apostles gain? Not money, not power, not status. They gained floggings, imprisonment, and execution. The martyrdom receipt. While some later legends are debated, secular agnostic historians like Bart Ehrman accept the historical core that Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, were martyred for their faith. Even Jewish historian Josephus confirms the execution of James. The forensic fact. As we often say, liars make poor martyrs. People will die for a lie they believe is true, but no one dies for a lie they know is a hoax. And variant B, the someone else reburial theory. It's called the RSHBS. A more sophisticated cold case theory, recently debated by Jimmy Akin and James Fodor. In the RSHBS model, reburial, silence, hallucination, bias, and socialization. It suggests Joseph of Arimathea moved the body in secret. They just never mentioned it. The forensic glitch. The theory relies on a chain of improbabilities for it to work. The reburial had to remain silent while the city was in total uproar over a resurrection. You have the multiplication problem. In forensics, when you stack 5 maybes, one on top of the other, the probability doesn't stay the same. It multiplies down towards 0. If each step is only 50% likely, the whole theory has a 3% chance of being true. If the reburial is contrary to Jewish custom, which it was, and the silence is psychologically improbable, which it is, the theory effectively collapses. The evidence shows that the stolen body theory doesn't account for the transformed lives of the disciples, and the hallucination theory doesn't account for the empty tomb. The naturalistic theories aren't just unlikely, they are forensically untenable. In the world of high-level academic skepticism, there is one primary objection used to dismantle the empty tomb narrative before it even starts. Critics argue that according to Roman law, victims of crucifixion, especially those executed for maestas, treason or sedition, were denied burial. They claimed the body of Jesus would have been left on the cross as a deterrent for scavengers or thrown into a mass grave like Gehenna. If this were true, there would be no tomb to find empty. But when we look at the provincial realpolitik of first century Judea, the mass grave theory hits a massive wall of historical and physical evidence. 1. The legal receipt, the Judean exception. While the general Roman rule was harsh, the Romans were pragmatic imperialists. Their primary goal in Jerusalem was to prevent riots, especially during the Passover powder cake atmosphere of Passover. The contemporaneous Jewish historian Flavius Josephus is explicit on this point. In the Jewish War, at his 452, he records, "The Jews are so careful about burial that even those who were crucified are taken down and buried before sunset. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a religious necessity based on Deuteronomy 21:23. To leave a body hanging would have defiled the land, a move that would have triggered massive religious uprisings. Pontius Pilate, a man who had already faced several near revolts, would have every reason to make a Judean exception. 2. The witness of Philo. We have another primary source from the same era, Philo of Alexandria. In his work Flaccus at 1083, he describes a practice of Roman governors granting the bodies of the executed to their families, especially during festivals. I have known cases where on the eve of a holiday, the authorities have given the bodies to their kinsfolk because they thought them worthy of burial and they should receive the customary rites. Forensic receipt, the nail in the heel. For centuries, skeptics argued that Jews couldn't have been buried because we had no archaeological proof that any crucified person in Judea was ever given a proper burial. This changed in 1968. In the Jerusalem suburb Givat HaMivtah, archaeologists discovered a 1st century rock-hewn family tomb. Inside an ossuary, they found the skeletal remains of a young man named Jehohanan. Embedded in his calcified heel bone was an 11.5 centimetre iron nail. Jehohanan was a commoner executed by Rome for sedition, yet he wasn't in a mass pit or an ashy. He was in a private, high-status family tomb. This find provided the physical smoking gun that proved that the Roman Judean exception was a reality. 4. The silent objection. Finally, we have to look at what is missing from the historical record. In the first 2 centuries, the enemies of the early church, the Sanhedrin and the Roman critics like Celsus, used every argument imaginable to discredit the movement. They claimed the disciples stole the body. They claimed the women were hallucinating. But not once in the ancient records did critics say Jesus wasn't buried in a tomb. He was thrown into a pit. If the mass grave theory was the historical reality, it would have been the ultimate case closed for the Romans. Their silence on this point is one of the loudest pieces of evidence in the file. They didn't argue about the fact of the burial. They argued about why the tomb was empty. The forensic data is clear. The Judean exception was in play. The burial was granted. The tomb was real, and on Monday morning the authorities had a problem they couldn't solve with a legal code. If the tomb was empty, and we've established even the most hostile ancient critics conceded that point, the only remaining question is, where did the body go? The most common clinical objection today is pragmatic disposal. The theory suggests that on Monday morning, once the Passover was over, the Roman or Jewish authorities moved the body from the private tomb to a common pit to prevent the site from becoming a pilgrimage for a dead rebel. It's a logical sounding theory, but it creates what we call a forensic bottleneck. Think about the logistics. 7 weeks after the execution, on the day of Pentecost, the apostles began preaching publicly in the heart of Jerusalem. They weren't doing this in a far-off city where facts were hard to check. They were doing it in the exact place where the event happened. They claimed the man the authorities had executed was now the risen Lord. If the Romans or the Sanhedrin had moved that body, they were sitting on the ultimate weapon. They didn't need to argue about theology, and they didn't need to arrest anyone. To end the movement in 5 minutes, I simply needed to lead the crowd to the new location, produce the body, and show the world the original signal was still dead. But they couldn't. Instead, the earliest recorded Jewish rebuttal, recorded by both the Gospel of Matthew and later by Justin Martyr, was that the disciples came by night and stole him. In a forensic sense, this is a hostile admission. You do not argue about how a body was stolen unless you've already admitted the fundamental fact: the body is gone. The authorities didn't point to a common pit, they pointed to a burglary they couldn't prove. Even a century later, the pagan philosopher Celsus, one of the most brilliant and hateful critics of the early church, was still trying to explain why the body was stolen. If there had been any Roman record, any paper trail showing the body had been moved to a pit, Celsus would have used it as his smoking gun. The fact that every early critic resorted to the stolen body narrative is the forensic admission that the authorities had lost control of the corpse. Their silence at Pentecost is the loudest evidence in the file. In any vast conspiracy, you look for the mastermind. Skeptics like Hiram Maccabee, A.N. Wilson and William Reed have long argued that the real founder of Christianity wasn't Jesus, but Paul of Tarsus. They suggest Paul was a saboteur, an outsider who hacked a failed Jewish movement into a new mystery religion, inventing the resurrection to spread to the Roman world. How do they think he did solve this scandalous nonsense? Contrarian scholars like Robert Eisman or G.W. Foote argue Paul used Hellenistic syncretism. They claim he blended Jewish messianism with the popular Greek mystery religions of the time, stories of dying and rising gods like Osiris, Attis or Adonis. To market it, they say, Paul stripped away the difficult Jewish law, like circumcision, to make it an easy sell to the Gentiles, reframing the total shame of the cross as a mystical cosmic victory. But this here theory also hits a forensic wall. 1. The Saul file, the elite insider. Paul wasn't a failed outsider. He was the ultimate insider. We can independently confirm his status. We have the Gamaliel receipt. Paul studied under Rabbi Gamaliel the Elder, a man so prominent that the Jewish Mishnah at Sota 9:15 says, "The glory of the law ceased when he died." Being Gamaliel's student is a first century equivalent of a Rhodes Scholarship. The Tarsus connection. The geographer Strabo confirms that Tarsus was an intellectual powerhouse, rivaling Athens. Paul's Roman citizenship and elite education imply a family of significant wealth. Then we have the hostile witness, the Ebionites. Even his 2nd century enemies, the Ebionites, didn't claim he was a nobody. Their polemics describe him as a high-level defector from the temple elite. The Damascus letters. Extradition rights granted to the high priest, documented by Josephus, prove that for Paul to be sent to Damascus with authority, he had to be trusted, high-ranking agent of the Sanhedrin. Then we have the friction correction. Conduct versus theology. Critics point to the friction between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles as a proof of two different religions. But look at the data. In Galatians 2, Paul rebukes Peter to his face. What were they arguing about? Not the resurrection, not the divinity of Christ. They were arguing about dinner. Paul calls out Peter's social hypocrisy for refusing to eat with Gentiles. In a forensic sense, if two witnesses are arguing over the details of conduct, it's because they've already agreed on a primary event. They were in total lockstep on the resurrection. The only friction was how that signal should disrupt first century social barriers. Then we have the identity spark. Finally, ask yourself the cui bono question. Who benefits? Paul had everything to lose: power, status, and a career in the Sanhedrin. He traded it for a life of verbal and physical stoning, shipwrecks, and eventually Nero's executioner. You don't trade a seat at the top table of the social ladder for a scandalous hoax unless you have encountered a fact that makes your old life a lie. They didn't share a philosophy, they shared a witness. In the 1950s, social psychologist Leon Festinger studied a cult that believed the world would end on a specific date. When that date passed and nothing happened, the group didn't give up. Instead, they doubled down, claiming their devotion had saved the world. Festinger called this cognitive dissonance, the mental gymnastics we perform to protect our deeply held beliefs when they are shattered by reality. Skeptics often apply this to the resurrection. They argued the disciples loved Jesus so much that they couldn't accept his death. To resolve the dissonance of a dead Messiah, they simply convinced themselves that he was alive. It's a clever psychological theory, but in a forensic investigation it fails a reality test. 1. The corpse versus the calendar. There is a massive difference between a failed date and a failed corpse. In Festinger's study, the failure was invisible. The world didn't end. You can explain that away with mercy or recalculation, but you cannot explain away a dead body. In the shame-based culture of first century Jerusalem, the physical bones of Jesus rotting in the pit would have been the ultimate dissonance killer. You don't double down on a resurrected Lord when your neighbours can point to his grave. Cognitive dissonance leads to excuses, not to the invention of a physically falsifiable miracle. And then 2, the category error. The Jewish world had no category for a resurrected Messiah in the middle of history. If the Messiah died, he was a failure. If he was crucified, he was cursed by God. Cognitive dissonance usually pushes people to stay within their existing worldview. A grieving Jew might have said, he was a great prophet who will rise at the end of time. They would have not have invented the scandalous, moronic claim that he had risen now. That didn't solve their dissonance. It made their social and religious shame 10 times worse. 3. The hostile witness problem. Cognitive dissonance only affects those who are already deeply invested in the belief. It explains why a grieving mother might see her lost son. But it explains zero about Saul of Tarsus or James. Saul wasn't grieving Jesus. He was actively trying to erase his name. James wasn't invested. He was a documented skeptic. You don't experience cognitive dissonance for a movement you hate or a brother you don't believe. For them to flip, they didn't need a psychological escape hatch. They needed an external fact. And 4. The length of the fuse. Finally, cognitive dissonance is a short-term fix. Once the adrenaline wears off and the new date also fails, or the persecution starts, the group inevitably dissipates. People don't endure 30 years of floggings, stonings, and eventual execution for a psychological coping mechanism. They know is a fix for a dead body. The resurrection isn't a story of men protecting their feelings. It's a story of men whose feelings and lives were shattered by a fact they never expected and couldn't ignore. We have spent this investigation looking at the cold, hard data. We've filtered the noise of tradition and focused strictly on the minimal facts accepted by the broad consensus of history. The fact of the execution, verified by Roman, Jewish and secular sources. The fact of the transformed followers, men who moved from cowardice to martyrdom. The fact of the converted enemies, the total life reversal of high-status skeptics like Paul and James. The fact of the empty tomb, an admission by the very authorities who tried to suppress the movement. Now, as an investigator, you are left with a choice. In forensics, we look for the best explanation, the one that accounts for all the data points without relying on a chain of impossible coincidences. On the one hand, you can choose to believe in a miracle of probability. You can believe that a group of uneducated fishermen executed a flawless body-snatching operation against the Roman guard, that they maintained a 30-year silent conspiracy while being flogged and executed, and that a series of mass multi-century hallucinations perfectly synchronized with the empty tomb and the defection of their most brilliant enemies. On the other hand, you can accept the historical singularity. You can accept the simplest explanation that actually covers all the facts. That the signal was real. That on the third day, the heartbeat of the man from Nazareth restarted and he walked out of the tomb. One theory requires you to ignore everything we know about human psychology and the laws of probability. The other requires you to admit that history has an anchor, an event so disruptive it changed the DNA of human civilization. You are not just a collection of random cells in a meaningless universe. You are part of a story that is grounded in a verifiable forensic fact. But if this event happened, if the original signal was that powerful, where is it today? How did a small group of kinsmen and fishermen in a Roman backwater become a global institution that lasted an empire that tried to kill it? Next week, we are following that trail to Pentecost, and we are going to look at what happened next. Thank you for watching. Please like, please share, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment below. I'll see you next week, and may God bless you and guide you.